Hey, my name's Kyle, and this is the beginning of a video series called Joan Deserves a Musical, where I try to convince you that Joan of Arc needs to have a Disney Renaissance-style animated musical about her life. And this first time, I'm actually at a conference. I'm traveling for work. The recording conditions are not great, but hopefully you will stick with me and future videos will be better. So let me start by giving you the backstory of how I first got this idea and why I think Joan deserves a miracle. So back a little more than a year ago, I was sitting around the dinner table, my wife and kids, and I was telling my kids, for whatever reason, the plot line of the classic film Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And I was describing the scene in the mall where Genghis Khan is destroying things and Beethoven is performing music and Joan of Arc is leading this like Pilates class. And my 6-year-old daughter says to me, "Who is Joan of Arc?" I was like, French teenager, I think, leaded the armies for some reason and got burned at the stake. I realized I didn't know the story. But fortuitously, just a few weeks earlier, we had rescued an entire World Book Encyclopedia set from our local library. They were getting rid of it because they'd got a newer one. And there it was on a shelf right in our dining room. And I said, "Kids, this is the perfect use of an encyclopedia. Let us not turn to the internet. Let us turn to actual books." And so I pull off the J encyclopedia and I find Joan of Arc, and it's just like a 2-column synopsis of her life. And I start skimming through it and summarizing it for my kids. And I began having all these questions, right? So Joan is this teenage peasant in the 1400s. The 100-Year War between France and England has been going on for 90 years at this point. It's looking like a hopeless cause. England has taken over most of France. The heir to the French throne, Charles, is unable to be crowned because the coronation city of Reims has been overtaken by the British. And Joan has this spiritual experience and feels like she is being called to lead the armies. This peasant girl, never been in battle before, but really feels that way. So she goes to the local French garrison, talks to the head soldier there and says, "Hey, my name's Joan. I think I should be in charge of the armies. Can you send me to Charles so he can put me in charge of the armies?" And the encyclopedia entry said in one very simple sentence, at first, the leader there was hesitant, but then he relented and sent her to Charles. I thought, well, why would he do that? And then she goes to Charles, and same thing. At first, Charles was reluctant to listen to her, but then he decided to give her an army. What? Why would you do that? And then it was like, and then, the army resented the fact that they were being led by this girl, but she won them over. How? Right? There were these important inflection points in the story where it was just unfathomable to me what these conversations must have looked like, how they ever worked. And it occurred to me in that moment that this needs to be a musical, right? Like if you imagine at each of these points, Joan doesn't give a stirring speech or she doesn't do something really, like perform some kind of miracle or magic trick, but instead just sings like a super catchy, Alan Menken or Lin-Manuel Miranda kind of song that gets our feet tapping and our heart rates up. And then, of course, we're rooting for her. And of course, the military leader sends her to the king, and the king sends her to the army, and the army follows her into war, right? And so this was an idea I was just kind of amusing myself with. I thought, this seems kind of fun. I wonder if it actually holds up. And so I went to the library. I live in Boston. We have a very good library. I got like 3 different biographies about the life of Joan of Arc. And I read them all through, and I learned 2 things. First of all, I learned the musical absolutely holds up, and it's the only way to make this story make a bit of sense. Joan of Arc is not a legend. We have a lot of firsthand historical accounts about her, more than anyone else from that era, and yet it's just very hard to understand what happened in these conversations, how they work. But a musical structurally would just do such a phenomenal job, right? And the reason I was thinking about this at that time is because my family was really into Encanto at that moment. We had just gotten it for Christmas. It had come out about a year earlier. And the thing that I think makes Encanto a really remarkable piece of storytelling is the function of the songs in the story. If you look at a movie like Frozen, which has truly excellent songs, it's a story with excellent songs in it. Encanto is a story that cannot be told without the songs, right? These sisters opening up to each other, the strong one saying that she's feeling overwhelmed, and the perfect one feeling tired of being perfect. It would be weird, like, to have a conversation, just in normal dialogue, where in that amount of space, right, we only have like a 90-minute runtime, to have these emotions and these relationships evolve so quickly. The only way to do it is with a really great song. And that's the sort of thing I think the Joan of Arc story demands, right? We could try to write some really interesting, persuasive dialogue. We could put some interesting or funny actions in there, but I think a modern audience is sort of jaded. And if a 14-year-old girl shows up and says to the leader of the army, hey, I had a vision from God, and he said I should be in charge of the army, and the leader of the army, under any circumstances, says, yeah, I believe you. That sounds good. We're going to be checked out. We're going to be like, no way that could happen. But if there's a really great song, we will go along with it because music transports us in a way emotionally that I don't think dialogue can. So the first thing I realized as I read all these Joan of Arc's biographies is, yes, she needs to be a musical. Everyone who's ever tried to tell her story without making a musical has done it wrong. And that should be corrected. The other thing I realized, which is maybe the more important insight, is everybody who has ever told her story in any modality has done it wrong because they've gotten entirely caught up in her death and framed her as a tragic character. Now, I've read the transcripts of her trials at the end of her life. They are exceptionally unjust. There are terrible things said and done to this poor girl, and then she's burned at the stake, right? And she's abandoned by the king she got crowned by all of her friends, and it is heartbreaking. And when you see just this innocent, pure girl who was able to do impossible things because of her faith and belief in something bigger than herself, and to see her reach this kind of tragic end, it is very hard not to become obsessed with that part of the story. But that is not the story of Joan of Arc. Let me tell you the story of Joan of Arc. Joan comes and takes charge of the armies, and she says to the king, the uncrowned king, I will get you crowned, and I will rescue the city of Orleans, which has been under siege for 4 months. And in the course of just a few months, she accomplishes both those things. And when the king is crowned King of France, at the coronation ceremony, she kneels down before him and she says, my mission is completed. I've done what I said I would do. Then she takes off her armor and hangs it in the chapel and says, I am a soldier no more. That is the story of Joan of Arc. A 14-year-old girl turned the tide of a multi-generational war in the course of like 3 months. That is incredible, and that is an inspirational story that needs to be told with zero caveats. The sequel, of course, then, is that her soldier friends say, hey, Joan, Paris is still held by the British. What if we go redeem that? And Joan's like, well, I don't have anything else to do. Let's go try. And then she goes, and then she gets captured, and then she gets burned at the stake, right? But that is not the story of Joan of Arc. That's a separate story, right? Regardless of how a heroic, inspirational figure dies, if they accomplish the mission they set out to do, they have completed their hero's journey, and that is the story we should be telling. So, I believe Joan deserves a musical, a really upbeat, inspirational retelling of her life and mission, focusing on just her success, her incredible, miraculous victory, and ignoring the fact that later terrible things happened to her. Maybe there is space in other movies and stories to explore that, except it's been done. It's been done to death. There are some movies that are just her death, ignoring all the wonderful things she did before it. Let's call it good. We've done enough of that. Let's have an inspirational, upbeat, exciting, adventurous hero story about this incredible woman who by herself did this impossible, crazy thing that no one had been able to do for 90 years in just a few months. And let's celebrate her for that. So that was the nexus of this idea. It was just dinner table chatter with me and my kids. And a lot of crazy stuff has happened since I went down this path of thinking she needs this musical, and that perhaps I could be the one to create it. And I will tell you more about that in future episodes.